The wrench slipped from Jake Morrison's grease-stained hands and clattered against the driveway pavement. For a moment he didn't move, couldn't move, because the sound of those two voices shattered through the quiet Saturday morning like breaking glass. His twin daughters, Emma and Lily, were sprinting toward him from the neighbor's house, their small faces twisted in terror, tears streaming down their cheeks, the kind of crying that only came from pure, unfiltered fear. They were screaming something that made his blood turn to ice. Mama won't wake up. Jake's heart stopped. His ex-wife, Rachel, had taken the girls for the weekend, their first visit in 3 months. She'd promised him she was clean, swore on their daughters' lives that the pills were behind her. He'd wanted to believe her. God, he'd wanted to believe her so badly. But the terror in his little girl's eyes told him a truth he wasn't ready to face. He was already running before his mind caught up with his body. The Morrison family hadn't been whole in a long time. 2 years ago, Rachel's addiction had torn through their marriage like wildfire through dry timber. Jake had fought for her, through the lies, the disappearances, the rehab stints that never stuck. But when he found Emma and Lily, just 4 years old, trying to wake their unconscious mother on the bathroom floor, something inside him broke in a way that couldn't be fixed. The divorce papers were filed a week later. Full custody granted 2 months after that. Now, as Jake burst through the neighbor's front door, Mrs. Patterson's house, where Rachel had been staying, every nightmare he'd buried came roaring back. Rachel lay motionless on the living room couch, her skin a sickly pale gray, her lips tinged with blue. Empty pill bottles scattered across the coffee table told the story Jake already knew by heart. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who'd been kind enough to give Rachel a chance, stood frozen in the doorway, phone trembling in her wrinkled hands. Jake's training kicked in before panic could. 4 years as a paramedic before the twins were born, before life got complicated, before he became a single dad working double shifts at the auto shop just to keep the lights on. His fingers found Rachel's neck, searching for a pulse. Faint, too faint. Her breathing was shallow, irregular. He'd called 911 before he even realized his phone was in his hand. But it was the twins sobbing behind him that cut deeper than any emergency ever could. Emma clutching Lily, both of them watching their father try to save the mother who kept choosing drugs over them. 4 years old, and they were learning lessons about love and loss that some people never understood in a lifetime. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but they felt like hours. Paramedics, people Jake once worked alongside, rushed in with practiced efficiency. They loaded Rachel onto a gurney, started an IV, administered naloxone. Jake watched it all with a strange detachment, as if he were watching a movie about someone else's life. One of the paramedics, a young woman named Sarah, caught his eye as they wheeled Rachel toward the ambulance. She didn't need to say anything. The look told him everything, touch and go. Maybe she'd make it, maybe she wouldn't. As the ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, Jake turned to find his daughters wrapped around Mrs. Patterson's legs, their small bodies still shaking with sobs. The elderly woman's eyes were filled with tears and apologies. She'd only left the room for 10 minutes, just 10 minutes to make lunch. She hadn't known Rachel had brought anything with her. Jake knelt down and opened his arms. Emma and Lily crashed into him, and he held them like they were the only real things left in the world. 'Cause maybe they were. His hands still smelled like motor oil and brake fluid. His shirt was torn from diving under the truck. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. But in that moment, holding his daughters as they cried into his shoulders, Jake Morrison made a silent promise. He would be enough. Whatever it took, however hard it got, he would be enough for them. Even if the world kept trying to break him piece by piece, he wouldn't let it break them. What Jake didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that Sarah, the paramedic who'd given him that knowing look, would walk back into his life 3 days later. And when she did, everything would change in ways he never saw coming. The hospital cafeteria coffee tasted like burnt regret, but Jake drank it anyway. 3 days since the overdose. 3 days of Emma and Lily asking questions he didn't know how to answer. 3 days of juggling work shifts with his elderly neighbor, Mr. Chen, who'd graciously agreed to watch the girls while Jake tried to hold the pieces of his life together. Rachel was alive, stable, The doctors said she'd make a full physical recovery. The restraining order papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under Jake's apartment door like a poisoned letter. His hands shook as he read the words, each sentence more unbelievable than the last. Rachel was claiming he'd threatened her, harassed her at the hospital, made her feel unsafe. She was petitioning for emergency custody of the twins, citing concerns about his mental stability and alleged substance abuse. Every word was a lie. Every accusation a weapon forged from desperation. But lies on official letterhead had a way of becoming truth if you didn't have the money to fight them. Jake's lawyer, a overworked public defender named Marcus, laid it out plainly. Rachel's new boyfriend was funding this. Chad Westbrook, heir to a commercial real estate fortune, had apparently decided that playing savior to a troubled addict made for a good redemption story. He'd hired expensive lawyers, filed motions, created a narrative where Jake was the villain and Rachel was the victim fighting to reunite with her daughters. The court date was set for 3 weeks away. In the meantime, Rachel's supervised visitation had been restored. Jake felt the world tilting beneath him. He'd survived the addiction, the divorce, the overdose. He'd built a fragile new life on nothing but willpower and duct tape. And now someone with money and lawyers was trying to take the only things that mattered. The twins could feel it. Kids always could. Emma became quiet, withdrawn, clutching her stuffed rabbit like a life preserver. Lily started acting out. Tantrums, defiance, anything to control a world spinning beyond her understanding. And Jake, running on fumes and fear, struggled to hold them all together. Sarah found him in his truck one evening, head in his hands, the weight of everything finally crushing him flat. She climbed into the passenger seat without asking, sat in silence until Jake could find words again. He told her everything. The restraining order, the custody battle, the lawyer who said they had a case but couldn't promise anything, the very real possibility that in 3 weeks he might lose his daughters to a system that valued money over truth. Sarah's response was immediate and fierce. She knew people, she had connections. Her supervisor at the hospital, Dr. Patricia Chen, had testified in custody cases before. Sarah would get statements from everyone who'd witnessed Jake's devotion. The daycare workers, Mr. Chen from next door, the auto shop owner who'd given Jake flexible hours so he could be there for school pickups. They would build a case made of truth so solid no amount of money could crack it. But more than that, Sarah promised she'd be there. Every court date, every meeting, every moment Jake needed someone to remind him he wasn't alone. Jake wanted to refuse, wanted to tell her she'd already given too much. But the truth was he needed her strength when his own ran dry. The weeks before the custody hearing became a blur of paperwork and preparation. Marcus worked overtime building their defense. Sarah collected statements. Jake documented every interaction, every payment, every moment of care he'd provided. And through it all, he kept showing up for his daughters. Breakfast, school, bedtime stories, Saturday morning pancakes. The normal, boring, beautiful rhythm of being a father. Rachel appeared at the apartment one afternoon, Chad Westbrook's BMW idling at the curb behind her. She looked healthier, cleaner, steadier, but there was something hard in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, and Jake had just been too in love to notice. She'd come to tell him she was doing this for the girls. That they deserved better than a struggling mechanic who couldn't give them the life Chad could provide. Private schools, dance lessons, a big house with a yard. She made it sound reasonable. Generous even. Jake listened without responding. Because what could he say? That love mattered more than money? That consistency mattered more than square footage? That the twins needed a parent who showed up? Not a parent who could afford expensive things? Rachel wouldn't understand. She never had. After she left, Jake found Emma standing in the hallway. His little girl had heard everything. The tears on her face broke something inside him that had barely healed. She asked him the question he'd been dreading. Asked if she and Lily were going to have to go live with Mommy and the new man. Asked if they'd still be able to see Daddy. Jake pulled her close and made a promise he prayed he could keep. Promised that no matter what happened, he would fight for them. Promised they were safe. Promised that love always, always found a way, even when he wasn't sure he believed it himself anymore. The night before the custody hearing, Jake lay awake staring at his ceiling, terror and exhaustion warring in his chest. He'd done everything right, been everything he could be. But sometimes right wasn't enough. Sometimes the world simply decided you didn't get to keep the things that mattered most. Sarah's text came through at 2 in the morning, as if she knew he'd be awake. "You're a good father. Jake, tomorrow everyone will see what I already know. You've got this." In the darkness of his bedroom, surrounded by silence and uncertainty, Jake held on to those words like a lifeline. Because whether or not he believed them, he had to walk into that courtroom and fight like they were true. The twins were counting on him, and Jake Morrison had never learned how to quit. The family courthouse smelled like floor wax and broken families. Jake sat at the defendant's table, because somehow defending your right to be a parent made you the defendant, in the only suit he owned, borrowed from Marcus and altered to fit his broader shoulders. Across the aisle, Rachel sat between her expensive lawyers, Chad Westbrook's hand possessively on her shoulder. She wouldn't meet Jake's eyes. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Margaret Torres, reviewed the files with an expression that gave nothing away. Marcus had warned Jake that Judge Torres was fair but tough. She didn't care about money, didn't care about sob stories. She cared about what was best for the children, full stop. Jake tried to take comfort in that, tried to believe that truth would be enough. Rachel's lawyers went first. They painted a picture of a struggling single father, overwhelmed by the demands of parenting, cited Jake's long work hours, his reliance on neighbors for childcare, the modest apartment. They brought up his paramedic career, how he'd left a stable job for manual labor at an auto shop. Made it sound like failure instead of sacrifice. They presented Chad Westbrook as the solution. Stable, wealthy, committed to supporting Rachel's recovery and providing the twins with opportunities Jake never could. They had statements from Rachel's therapist about her progress, letters from Chad's character references, financial documents showing the life they could provide. It was a masterclass in making poverty look like neglect. Then Marcus stood up. He was younger than Rachel's lead attorney, his suit off the rack instead of tailored. But when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of truth. He started with the obvious, that wealth didn't equal love, and that children needed presence more than presence. He walked through Jake's devotion in painstaking detail, the daily routines, the sacrifices, the way he'd rebuilt his entire life around his daughters after the divorce. But then Marcus did something unexpected. He called Sarah to the stand. She walked to the witness box in her hospital scrubs, having come straight from a shift. Under oath, she testified about the first time she'd met Jake, his daughters crying, his ex-wife overdosing, and his immediate instinctive response to protect and care for the twins, even as his world collapsed. She described the months afterward. The coffee conversations, meeting Emma and Lily, watching Jake be present, engaged, exhausted, but never giving up. And then Sarah said something that made Rachel's lawyers shift uncomfortably in their seats. She testified about the supervised visitation 2 weeks prior, how she'd been working the ER when Rachel brought the twins in, claiming Lily had fallen. But the bruising pattern didn't match the story. The defensive way Emma had shrunk from Chad. The terror in Lily's eyes when he raised his voice in the waiting room. Sarah had filed a report with Child Protective Services. It was still under investigation. The courtroom went silent. Rachel's face drained of color. Chad's hand dropped from her shoulder. Judge Torres requested the CPS file, asked pointed questions about the incident. Rachel's lawyers scrambled, but the damage was done. The veneer of stability had cracked, revealing something darker underneath. Then it was Jake's turn to testify. He spoke simply, honestly, about loving his daughters more than his own life. About the fear of losing them, about knowing he couldn't give them everything but promising to give them what mattered most: safety, consistency, unconditional love. He didn't cry, didn't beg, just told the truth in a voice steady with exhaustion and hope. When he mentioned finding Rachel unconscious while his daughters screamed for help, Rachel finally broke. Tears streamed down her face. Her lawyers called for a recess, but Judge Torres denied it. The judge had questions for Rachel, for Chad, about the bruises, about the supervised visit, about whether Rachel truly believed her daughters were better off in a home where violence, even accidental, had already occurred. Rachel couldn't answer, or wouldn't. She just cried while her lawyers whispered urgently. After 3 hours of testimony, Judge Torres called another recess. She'd review everything and issue her ruling by end of day. Jake walked out of the courtroom on shaking legs, Sarah's hand steady on his arm. They sat on a bench outside, neither speaking. Because what was there to say? They'd done everything they could. The rest was out of their hands. Marcus found them an hour later. The ruling had come through. Judge Torres had terminated Rachel's visitation pending the outcome of the CPS investigation. Full custody remained with Jake. Rachel would need to complete another rehab program, submit to regular drug testing, and undergo a psychological evaluation before any future visitation could be considered. And she'd be doing it without Chad. Westbrook, whom the judge had noted, was not to have any contact with the minors. Jake didn't remember standing, didn't remember Marcus shaking his hand or Sarah hugging him. He just remembered the overwhelming relief of knowing his daughters were safe, that they were still his, that the fight was over, at least for now. That evening, Jake picked up Emma and Lily from Mr. Chen's apartment. He'd promised them ice cream regardless of the outcome. But now, walking into that familiar living room and seeing their uncertain faces, he could give them the answer they'd been waiting for. They were staying together. No more courtrooms. No more uncertainty. Just home. The twins crashed into him with the force of small hurricanes, and Jake held them while they cried happy tears into his shoulders. Mr. Chen quietly stepped out to give them privacy, and in that moment, surrounded by his daughter's relief and love, Jake Morrison finally let himself believe it. 6 months after the custody hearing, Jake Morrison's life looked different in ways both small and profound. The auto shop had promoted him to lead mechanic with better pay and benefits. The twins had stopped having nightmares, and Sarah had become part of their lives in a way that felt natural, inevitable. Like she'd always been meant to be there. They took it slow. Deliberately, carefully slow. Because Jake had Emma and Lily to think about, and Sarah understood that any relationship with him came as a package deal. But slow didn't mean uncertain. It meant building something with a foundation solid enough to last. It started with Saturday morning pancakes. Sarah would show up with fresh strawberries and whipped cream, and the 4 of them would crowd into Jake's small kitchen making a mess and laughing. Then came movie nights where Emma would fall asleep on Sarah's lap halfway through. Parent-teacher conferences where Sarah sat beside Jake, offering support without overstepping. Quiet evenings after the twins went to bed, where Jake and Sarah would sit on the apartment's tiny balcony and just talk. About everything and nothing. About dreams deferred and futures imagined. The twins loved her, but more than that, they trusted her. They'd learned young to be cautious with new people, to protect themselves from disappointment. But Sarah had proven herself through consistency, through showing up, through loving them in the patient, steady way they needed. Jake found himself imagining a future he'd stopped letting himself want. A bigger apartment, maybe a small house, family dinners and shared holidays. Sarah's laugh echoing through spaces that had been too quiet for too long. The possibility of not doing this alone anymore. But first, there was something he needed to do. Jake took the twins to visit Rachel on a Sunday afternoon. It had been 6 months since the hearing, and Rachel had completed rehab. The CPS investigation had concluded. Chad was facing charges, and Rachel had cut all ties with him. She was living in a sober living facility, working part-time at a bookstore, attending meetings daily. The supervised visitation had been restored on a limited basis. Jake didn't have to bring them. The court order gave him full discretion. But he'd learned something in the years since the divorce. Hate was too heavy to carry, and his daughters deserved the chance to know their mother, flawed and broken as she was, if she could stay healthy. The visit was awkward. Emma was cautious. Lily was clingy. Rachel cried when she saw them, overwhelmed by how much they'd grown. But she didn't make promises she couldn't keep, didn't ask for forgiveness she hadn't earned. She just sat with them, read them a story, and told them she loved them. When it was time to leave, Emma surprised everyone by hugging Rachel goodbye. It was brief, tentative, but it was something, a small seed of possibility planted in difficult soil. As Jake drove home, Lily asleep in her car seat and Emma quietly coloring, he felt a strange sense of peace. Rachel would probably always struggle. The addiction would always be there, lurking, but she was trying. And maybe that was enough. Maybe the best thing he could do for his daughters was model grace without sacrificing their safety. That evening, after the twins were asleep, Jake found Sarah on the balcony. She'd started keeping a toothbrush at his apartment, a change of clothes, small signs of a life beginning to intertwine with his. He told her about the visit, about Emma's hug, about feeling like maybe finally, the pieces were falling into something resembling a whole picture. Sarah listened, then turned to face him fully. In the dim porch light, her expression was serious, vulnerable. She told him she loved him. Had for months, probably. Loved him and his daughters and the life they were building together. She wasn't asking for promises or pressure, just wanted him to know, wanted him to understand that when she imagined her future, it looked an awful lot like this. Like his small apartment and Saturday pancakes and the chaotic beauty of raising two remarkable little girls. Jake's response came easier than he'd expected, because it was true, had been true for longer than he'd admitted even to himself. He loved her too. Loved her kindness and strength and the way she'd walked into his disaster of a life and stayed. Not to fix him, but to stand beside him while he fixed himself. They didn't need to plan it all out right then. Didn't need to rush towards some finish line. They had time. They had patience. They had something real and worth protecting. 3 months later, on an unremarkable Tuesday, Sarah officially moved in. Emma and Lily helped carry boxes, treating it like an adventure. Mr. Chen brought over a casserole to celebrate. The apartment felt full in a way it never had before, full of voices and laughter, and the comfortable chaos of a family learning to be whole again. Jake would think back sometimes to that Saturday morning when his daughters had come running to him, crying that Mama wouldn't wake up. How that moment had felt like an ending, like everything good had finally, definitively broken. But it hadn't been an ending at all. It had been a beginning disguised as catastrophe, a turning point that led to Sarah, to healing, to learning that broken things could be put back together if you had patience and help and love enough to try. On Saturday mornings now, Jake still repaired trucks in his driveway. But he didn't work alone anymore. Emma and Lily would hand him tools, their small hands greasy and confident. Sarah would bring lemonade and sandwiches, kissing the top of his head as she passed. And in those ordinary moments, wrenches clanking, daughters giggling, love surrounding him like sunlight, Jake Morrison understood something profound. Heroes didn't always wear capes or uniforms. Sometimes they wore grease-stained jeans and determination. Sometimes they showed up with coffee and stayed through the chaos. Sometimes they were 4-year-old girls who survived the unimaginable and still believed in love. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, heroes walked into your life when you needed them most and reminded you that broken could become beautiful, that endings could birth new beginnings, and that family wasn't always about blood. Sometimes family was about who stayed, who showed up, who loved you through the disaster.